There are moments in life when you realize you're the only person in the room who sees the truth, and that knowledge becomes a weight you carry alone. For Morgan Gold, that moment arrived on a winter night in Manhattan when snow pressed against the windows of the Anderson penthouse and silence hung in the air like held breath. It was close to midnight. The city glittered below in streaks of amber and red, but inside the penthouse, the atmosphere felt suspended, warm and golden and dangerously still. The scent of leather furniture mixed with Cuban cigars, and the faint trace of expensive cologne that clung to everything Chris Anderson touched. Morgan had been on her feet since dawn, her maid's uniform crisp despite the hours. Her movements automatic after 8 months of serving in this world where power wore tailored suits and spoke in comfortable silences. Her back ached, her feet throbbed, and the careful neutrality she wore like armor was beginning to crack at the edges. But she could not rest. Not tonight. Not when every instinct she'd developed surviving in a world that overlooked women like her was screaming that something was wrong. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, keep watching to the end. Now, take a moment and let us know you're here. Subscribe to our channel, share this video, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Every notification, every word you share with us, helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Now, let's jump into the story. The main room hummed with controlled energy. Bodyguards stood at precise intervals along the walls, their faces blank, their hands never far from concealed weapons. Morgan moved through them like water through stone, a silver serving tray balanced perfectly in her hands. Her steps practiced and soundless. Her entire presence calibrated to be helpful without being memorable. She had learned the art of invisibility, not because she wanted to disappear, but because being seen too clearly in Chris Anderson's world could be dangerous. And that was precisely why she saw what no one else did. Chris Anderson, seated at the leather chair that might as well have been a throne, documents spread before him, his white shirt open at the collar to reveal the edge of ink that marked his chest, stories written in his skin that he'd never explain to someone like her. She had served him nearly every day for 8 months, always the same rhythm. She knew his patterns better than most people knew their own. The way he read with total absorption, the slight tension in his jaw when he was calculating risk, the precise moment each evening when he'd remove his watch and set it on the table. But everyone who worked in the Anderson penthouse understood that serving Chris Anderson required perfection. Because the people who made mistakes didn't get second chances. They simply vanished from the schedule, erased without explanation. Morgan had learned not to ask about men like Chris Anderson. In Manhattan, where legitimate wealth and criminal power danced in the same rooms, survival meant keeping your eyes down and your observations to yourself. She knew he was powerful in ways that made politicians nervous. Knew the faint roughness in his voice carried Brooklyn in its edges. Knew his suits were custom made, each one worth more than Morgan had earned in the past year. And tonight, she knew with absolute certainty that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. The first time Morgan Gold ever served Chris Anderson directly had been a night in late March when spring refused to arrive, and ice still clung to the penthouse windows. The head of household staff pulled her aside with instructions delivered in a whisper. Do not speak unless he speaks to you first. Do not make eye contact unless he initiates it. Do not linger. Chris Anderson was not handsome in the traditional sense. His face carried a brutal elegance, sharp jawline marked by a thin scar, dark eyes that weren't cold but penetrating enough to make a person feel X-rayed. Stripped of pretense, he was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with economical grace, wasting no motion, telegraphing no weakness. When Morgan set the crystal tumbler at his right hand that first night, he looked up. You're new. Yes, sir. I've been with the household for 2 months, but this is my first time serving you directly. His eyes held hers, dark, assessing, dangerously intelligent. What's your name? Morgan Gold, sir. He nodded once, returned to his papers, and she felt she had just crossed a threshold she hadn't known existed. In the months that followed, Morgan watched him more closely than she should. The way he listened to his men report, his fingers tapping once against the table when someone lied, the way his eyes swept the room before settling, mapping exits and threats with the instinct of someone who'd survived by staying 3 moves ahead. Chris spoke very little, but every word carried weight. And Morgan sensed something she could not allow herself to articulate. This man saw things others missed, and she had begun to realize she saw things others missed too. Chris kept bodyguards close. Always. Eric in particular, who'd been at Chris's side longer than anyone. For Morgan, that was the first piece of the puzzle that made her pay closer attention than was safe. And then came the night. 3 weeks before this winter evening, when she saw Eric standing on the penthouse balcony at 2 a.m., whispering into his phone, his face drained of color, his body language wrong, hunched, furtive, nervous. That was when Morgan understood. In Chris Anderson's world, silence could be protection. But it could also be betrayal. The second sign came when a fake wine supplier entered the penthouse. The way Eric accepted the package, avoiding Chris's eyes, made her blood run cold. The third sign arrived tonight. Chris asked Eric for a status update. Eric hesitated, a fraction of a second, but Morgan noticed. Chris didn't. He trusted Eric more than anyone, and that was why Morgan's heart hammered as she carried a silver tray toward Chris's table, a folded paper hidden beneath the linen napkin. She had seconds to stop a man like Chris Anderson from walking into a death trap he didn't even know existed. She set the tray down, positioned the napkin within Chris's reach, and leaned close, her lips near his ear. Do not react. Don't look at him. You're not safe. Chris lifted the napkin. His eyes dropped to the note. Your fucking bodyguard sold you out. You are the payment. His jaw tightened. His eyes lifted, slowly, deliberately, and met Morgan's gaze. For the first time since she'd worked in his home, she saw fear hidden behind steel. But she also saw recognition, respect, and the specific kind of gratitude that came from understanding that someone had just saved your life. Chris rose with movements that appeared casual and said in a voice that betrayed nothing, Morgan, I need fresh files from my office. Come with me. As Morgan followed Chris Anderson away from Eric's position, she understood that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to calculate. She had stepped into the light, and in Chris Anderson's world, there was no stepping back into shadow. Morgan had not always been this perceptive. Life had carved sharp instincts into her. Growing up in foster care in Harlem had taught her to read danger in the shift of a voice, the tension in shoulders, the split-second hesitation that separated truth from lies. She'd learned that survival belonged to those who noticed what others missed, who understood that threats rarely announced themselves with fanfare. They arrived quietly, dressed in familiarity, hiding behind trust until the moment they struck. Those instincts had kept her alive through childhood homes where kindness was conditional and violence lurked behind closed doors. They'd guided her through jobs where men saw uniforms instead of people, where being invisible meant being safe. And those same instincts had been screaming at her for 3 weeks now. Ever since the first night she noticed Eric behaving like a man with something to hide. The first warning came on a Tuesday in early November, when autumn's chill had sharpened into something crueler. Morgan had stayed late to finish inventory in the supply closets, the kind of tedious work that kept her employed but invisible. It was nearly midnight when she passed through the darkened hallway toward the service elevator and caught movement on the balcony through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eric stood alone in the cold, his breath misting in the air, his phone pressed low against his thigh, as if trying to hide it from view, even though no one else was around. His hand cupped over the speaker, his body hunched forward, his face drained of color in the harsh glow of the city lights below. Morgan stopped in the shadows, instinct telling her not to announce her presence. She couldn't hear his words, but she could read his body language, the nervous shifting of weight from foot to foot, the way his free hand kept clenching and unclenching at his side, the glances he threw over his shoulder toward the penthouse interior. This wasn't a man having a casual conversation. This was a man afraid of being caught. When Eric finally ended the call, he stood for a long moment staring out at Manhattan as if the city held answers he desperately needed. Then he wiped his palm across his face, straightened his shoulders, and returned inside, wearing the same blank professional expression he always carried. Morgan said nothing, filed the observation away, told herself it could be anything: a personal problem, financial trouble, family emergency. But the unease settled into her chest and refused to leave. The second warning arrived 6 days later, more concrete and infinitely more disturbing. A man Morgan had never seen before entered the penthouse in the middle of Chris's business day, credentials identifying him as a wine supplier delivering a vintage Chris had supposedly ordered. He wore the uniform, black polo shirt, company logo embroidered on the chest, but something about him felt wrong. His shoes, for one thing. Italian leather, custom made, easily $2,000. Morgan knew because she'd polished Chris's identical pair that morning. No delivery driver wore shoes like that. And his eyes. They swept the penthouse with too much interest, cataloging exits and security positions, lingering on the surveillance cameras with the focus of someone conducting reconnaissance. Eric met him at the door, accepted the sealed bottle with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and then the supplier reached into his jacket and withdrew a small black pouch, pressing it into Eric's palm with a gesture that looked practiced, rehearsed. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, confirmation passing between them without words, before the man left and Eric slipped the pouch into his pocket with movements designed not to be noticed. But Morgan noticed. She always noticed. She watched Eric later that afternoon, saw him check the pouch twice when he thought no one was looking, saw the tension radiating from his shoulders like heat from pavement. Whatever he'd received, it wasn't payment. It felt more like instruction, like the final piece of a plan clicking into place. The third warning came tonight, less than an hour before Morgan slipped the note beneath Chris's napkin. Chris had called Eric over for a routine security briefing, asking about preparations for an upcoming meeting with associates from Philadelphia. Standard procedure. Eric had given these reports hundreds of times. But tonight, when Chris asked, "Status on the Philadelphia arrangements?" Eric hesitated, half a second, barely perceptible. His mouth opened a fraction too late. His eyes flickered toward the window before returning to Chris's face, and when he finally answered, "Everything's confirmed, boss. No complications." His voice carried a tightness Morgan had never heard before. Chris didn't notice. He nodded, returned to his documents, dismissed Eric with a wave of his hand. But Morgan, standing near the bar refreshing water glasses, felt ice flood her veins. Because in that half-second of hesitation, she'd seen everything. The calculation, the fear, the weight of deception. Eric wasn't just lying to Chris, he was delivering him. The pieces assembled themselves in Morgan's mind with terrible clarity. The midnight phone call, coordination with whoever wanted Chris removed, the black pouch from the fake supplier, instructions, timing, perhaps even payment. the hesitation about Philadelphia, because that's where it would happen. That's where Eric had agreed to hand Chris over like currency in a transaction Morgan couldn't begin to understand. She'd seen this pattern before, though never on this scale. Growing up in foster care, she'd learned to read the signs when older kids planned to hurt someone, when adults wore kindness as camouflage for cruelty. In Harlem, she'd learned to sense when men approached with violence dressed as conversation. In every workplace she'd survived, she'd learned to spot the moment before power decided to crush someone too weak to fight back. This was the same pattern, magnified to catastrophic scale. Eric had been planning this for weeks, maybe longer, and Chris, powerful, perceptive Chris, trusted him too completely to see it. Morgan's hands shook as she set down the water pitcher. Every logical thought in her head screamed at her to stay silent, to keep her eyes down, to let powerful men handle their own dangerous business. Warning Chris meant stepping into a world where she didn't belong, risking her life on instincts that could be wrong, painting a target on her back that would never disappear. But staying silent meant watching a man die when she could have prevented it, meant carrying that weight for the rest of her life, meant becoming complicit in something her conscience couldn't survive. She thought about the girl she'd been in Harlem. Invisible, overlooked, dismissed as insignificant by everyone who held power over her survival. She'd promised herself that if she ever had the chance to be more than invisible, to matter in a way that changed something, she would take it, even if it killed her. Morgan made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She would warn Chris Anderson. She would slip him the note, whisper the truth, and pray he believed her before Eric's plan reached its final stage. And if she was wrong, if her instincts had failed her this time, then at least she would die knowing she'd tried to save a life instead of watching it end in silence. The moment arrived with the weight of inevitability, as if every choice Morgan had made in her life had been leading her toward this single act of calculated courage. Chris sat in his leather chair, the one that commanded the room without effort. A confidential document spread before him. The overhead lights caught the angles of his face, casting shadows that made him look carved from stone rather than flesh. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of intricate tattoos that disappeared beneath the fabric. Ink that told stories of violence and survival in a language Morgan couldn't fully read, but instinctively understood. Behind him, Eric stood at his usual position near the eastern wall, flanked by two other bodyguards whose names Morgan had never learned. They were statues in expensive suits, their faces blank, their hands clasped at their waists in identical postures of disciplined readiness. None of them looked at Morgan as she approached with the silver tray. To them, she was part of the furniture, present when needed, invisible otherwise. Perfect. Morgan's heart hammered so violently against her ribs she wondered if the sound was audible, if the tremor in her pulse was visible in her throat. But her hands remained steady as she crossed the Persian rug, her steps soundless, her breathing controlled through sheer force of will. The folded piece of paper sat beneath the linen napkin on her tray, her handwriting disguised, her words brutal and direct because there was no time for subtlety or eloquence. She had one chance to do this right. One moment to change the trajectory of the night before Eric's plan reached whatever terrible conclusion he'd orchestrated. Chris didn't look up as she approached. His attention remained fixed on the document, financial projections, perhaps, or intelligence reports on rivals, the kind of sensitive information that moved through his world like currency. Morgan positioned herself at his right side, the angle that placed her body between Chris and Eric's direct line of sight. She set down the crystal tumbler of scotch first, exactly where he preferred it. Then the small plate of pistachios he sometimes ate while working. and finally, with movements that appeared no different from any other evening, she placed the linen napkin within easy reach of his hand. Beneath it, the note waited like a bomb with a lit fuse. Morgan leaned closer than she'd ever dared before, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that clung to his skin and the faint trace of cigar smoke that seemed permanently woven into everything he touched. Her lips hovered inches from his ear, and she felt the dangerous intimacy of the position. A maid whispering to a man who could have her erased with a single word, crossing boundaries that had kept her safe for 8 months. "Don't react," she whispered, her voice so low it barely disturbed the air between them. "Don't look at him. You're not safe." She felt Chris go absolutely still, not the relaxed stillness of a man at rest, but the coiled tension of a predator recognizing danger. His hand moved toward the napkin with the same casual efficiency he brought to every gesture. But Morgan saw the slight change in his breathing, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He lifted the napkin, unfolded the paper beneath it, read the words that would either save his life or end hers. "Your fucking bodyguard sold you out. You are the payment." For 3 heartbeats, Chris didn't move, didn't breathe. The document before him might as well have ceased to exist. Morgan remained close, her body angled to partially shield the note from view, acutely aware of Eric standing 15 feet away, of the other guards watching the room with trained vigilance, of how quickly this moment could turn lethal if anyone realized what had just transpired. Then Chris lifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately, with the iron control of a man who'd spent his entire life mastering his reactions, and their eyes locked. Morgan had served him for 8 months, had watched him conduct business, issue orders, handle crises with the calm of someone who'd seen every variation of chaos and learned to navigate them all. She'd seen him angry, focused, coldly efficient, even occasionally amused in that subtle way powerful men allowed themselves when they thought no one important was watching. But she had never seen him afraid. Until now. It was buried deep, hidden behind layers of steel and calculated composure, visible only because Morgan had learned to read the micro-expressions that revealed what people tried desperately to hide. The slight widening of his pupils, the barely perceptible tension in the muscles around his eyes, the way his breathing changed rhythm for a fraction of a second before he forced it back under control. Chris Anderson was afraid. Not of Eric specifically, but of the implications, the betrayal, the realization that his most trusted protection had become his greatest vulnerability. But alongside that fear, Morgan saw something else. Something that made her breath catch, despite the terror coursing through her veins. Recognition. Not of her as the invisible maid who'd served him for months, but as an equal in this moment. Someone who'd seen what he'd missed, who'd risked everything to warn him, who'd just proven herself more loyal than the man he'd trusted for years. And gratitude. Raw, genuine, dangerous gratitude that came from understanding someone had just saved your life. Chris held her gaze for another heartbeat, and in that silent exchange, everything changed between them. Morgan was no longer invisible. She was a witness, an ally. A variable that had just altered the equation of his survival. His eyes flicked toward Eric, with movements so subtle anyone not watching for them would have missed it entirely. Then toward the guards along the walls, then toward the hallway that led to his private quarters. Calculating, mapping, planning his next move with the speed of someone who'd learned to think 3 steps ahead, even in crisis. When his gaze returned to Morgan, it carried a weight that felt like a promise and a warning simultaneously. Chris folded the note with hands that appeared perfectly steady, slipped it into his pocket, and rose from his chair with the casual ease of a man simply tired of sitting. He stretched slightly, rolled his shoulders as if working out tension from hours at his desk, and said in a voice that betrayed nothing, "Morgan, I need the quarterly reports from my office. Come with me." Not a request, not even really a command. Just a statement delivered with the assumption of compliance. The kind of directive that wouldn't raise suspicion because he issued similar instructions daily. But Morgan understood what it really was. Extraction. Protection. Removal of a witness from the immediate danger zone before he made his next move. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Chris walked toward the hallway with his usual measured stride, showing no sign of urgency, no indication that anything had changed. Morgan followed 3 steps behind, as protocol required, acutely aware of Eric's eyes tracking their movement, of the other bodyguards shifting slightly as Chris passed, of how fragile this moment was, balanced on the edge of a knife, one wrong gesture away from catastrophic violence. As they crossed the threshold into the private corridor, away from Eric's direct line of sight, Morgan felt the full weight of what she'd just done settle over her like a physical thing. She had stepped into the light. She had chosen a side. She had made herself visible to a man who operated in a world where visibility meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. And there was no stepping back. The private corridor felt longer than Morgan remembered, the silence between her and Chris stretching with tension that made the air difficult to breathe. The moment they rounded the corner out of Eric's sightline, Chris's entire demeanor shifted. The casual facade dropped like a mask removed, replaced by something harder. Sharper, deadly focused. He didn't speak, didn't slow his pace. Just led her deeper into the penthouse's private wing, past rooms she'd cleaned but never truly understood the purpose of, until they reached a door with a biometric lock she'd never seen anyone access. Chris pressed his palm to the scanner. The door opened with a quiet hiss, revealing a room Morgan hadn't known existed. Walls lined with monitors, sophisticated equipment humming with barely audible efficiency. The nerve center of a surveillance system far more extensive than she'd imagined. 2 guards materialized from somewhere behind them. Not Eric, not the usual rotation. Men whose faces Morgan recognized as part of Chris's earliest inner circle. He nodded to them once, a silent command that sent them positioning themselves at the entrance, blocking access. "Wait here," Chris said to Morgan, his voice low and stripped of any softness. "Don't leave this hallway. Don't speak to anyone. Understand?" "Yes, sir." He disappeared into the monitoring room, the door sealing behind him with a finality that made Morgan's already racing heart kick into an even more frantic rhythm. She stood in the corridor, her back against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. Her hands trembled now that no one was watching, the adrenaline that had kept her steady finally breaking through her control. She'd warned Chris Anderson that his most trusted bodyguard planned to kill him. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now her survival depended entirely on whether he believed her, and whether he could act quickly enough to stop whatever Eric had set in motion. Inside the monitoring room, Chris moved with surgical precision, his fingers flying across keyboards, pulling up security footage from the past 3 weeks. The screens flickered to life, displaying multiple angles of the penthouse interior and exterior, timestamps marking each moment with cold, digital accuracy. He started with the date Morgan had mentioned, early November, near midnight, fast-forwarded through empty hallways until movement caught his eye. There, the balcony. Eric's figure illuminated by city lights, phone pressed to his ear, body language screaming guilt even through the grainy footage. Chris leaned closer, his jaw tightening. He'd trusted Eric for 7 years. Had elevated him above dozens of others who'd proven their loyalty with blood and silence. And now, he was watching that trust dissolve frame by frame. He pulled up footage from the wine delivery, watched the supplier enter. Expensive shoes, two observant eyes, the professional assessment of someone conducting reconnaissance. Watched Eric accept the bottle, then the black pouch, their exchange smooth and practiced. Chris rewound the footage, zoomed in on the supplier's face, committed it to memory. Then, he pulled up exterior camera angles from that same time period. What he found made his blood run cold. While the supplier had been inside, two vehicles had parked across the street. Unmarked sedans with tinted windows, engines running. Men waiting, watching. The supplier had signaled them with a brief hand gesture before entering the building, another signal when he left. This wasn't a simple payoff. This was coordination. Chris pulled up more footage, searching for patterns. And there they were, laid out with damning clarity. Eric systematically disabling cameras in specific corridors over the past 2 weeks, always briefly, always in ways that might seem like technical glitches. Eric adjusting his patrol routes, creating gaps in coverage near the service elevators and the underground parking garage. Eric signaling through the penthouse windows at precise times, 3 fingers against the glass, a gesture that could look casual but repeated with too much regularity to be coincidence. Someone was watching from outside. Someone was receiving confirmation that the plan was progressing. Chris leaned back in his chair, the full architecture of the betrayal revealing itself. This wasn't Eric acting alone out of greed or desperation. This was a professional contract. Someone powerful wanted Chris removed, and Eric had agreed to deliver him. Not with violence inside the penthouse where security was absolute, but by creating a vulnerability, a window of opportunity, a moment when Chris would be exposed. The Philadelphia meeting. That's where it would happen. Eric would engineer a situation, a route, a position where Chris would be vulnerable and the people waiting could finish what they'd paid for. Chris wasn't the target of an assassination. He was the product of a transaction. And his price had already been paid. Morgan stood in the corridor, trying to steady her breathing, when she felt it. A shift in the air. A presence that didn't belong. She turned her head slightly and saw him reflected in the polished surface of a decorative mirror mounted on the opposite wall. A man she'd never seen before. Not staff. Wrong clothes. Wrong posture. Not security. No earpiece. No weapon visible but a bulge under his jacket that suggested one hidden. His eyes were too sharp, too focused, tracking her with the intensity of someone who'd been given a specific target. Morgan's pulse spiked. She glanced toward the monitoring room door where Chris's guards stood. But they were facing the other direction, focused on protecting their boss, not on a maid standing in the hallway. The man moved closer, his footsteps quiet against the marble floor, closing the distance between them with predatory purpose. Morgan's mind raced through options. Scream, run, fight. But her body felt frozen, trapped between training that told her to stay invisible and instinct that screamed danger. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. Close enough that his breath brushed her cheek when he leaned in. "You shouldn't have meddled," he whispered, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd delivered this kind of message before, who understood that words were often more effective than immediate violence. "Now you're a problem that needs solving." His hand moved toward his jacket, toward whatever weapon waited there, and Morgan's paralysis broke. She opened her mouth to scream, "Step away from her!" Chris's voice cut through the corridor like a blade, cold and absolutely lethal. He stood at the monitoring room entrance, flanked by his 2 guards, his expression carrying a fury Morgan had never witnessed, controlled but barely. Violence held in check by the thinnest margin of will. The man froze, his hand still halfway to his weapon, calculating his odds. Then he saw the guards' hands moving toward their own concealed firearms, saw Chris's stance shift into something that suggested he didn't need a gun to be dangerous, and he understood his window had closed. "I'm leaving," the man said, his hands rising slowly in a gesture of temporary surrender. "No trouble." "You're not leaving," Chris said quietly. "You're going to tell me who sent you, and then you're going to explain exactly what Eric promised would happen tonight." The man's eyes flicked between Chris and the exit, weighing options that were rapidly diminishing. Morgan pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering, watching a confrontation unfold that she'd triggered simply by trusting her instincts and choosing to speak. Chris took a single step forward, and something in that movement, the controlled violence, the absolute certainty, made the man's resistance crumble. "Eric said the girl saw too much," he said, his voice tight. "Said she'd warned you. Said she was a loose end that needed cleaning up before the Philadelphia handoff." Chris's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering to Morgan for a brief moment. Assessment? Confirmation? Something that might have been regret that she'd been pulled into this. "The handoff," Chris repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Tell me everything." The guards dragged the man away, his protests fading into the depths of the penthouse. Chris stood motionless for a moment, his breathing controlled, but his eyes carrying a storm Morgan could feel even from across the corridor. Then he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "With me. Now." He didn't wait for her response. Just moved down the hallway toward another door Morgan had never seen opened. She followed, her legs unsteady, adrenaline still flooding her system from how close she'd come to whatever that man had been sent to do. The room Chris led her into was small, windowless, soundproofed, the kind of space designed for conversations that couldn't be overheard. He closed the door, and suddenly the air felt impossibly thick, the silence oppressive. Chris turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd slipped him the note, she saw the raw intensity of his focus directed entirely at her. Not as the maid who served his coffee, not as part of the background, but as someone who required his complete attention. "Why did you warn me?" His voice was quiet, but the question carried weight that demanded truth. "You could have stayed silent, kept yourself safe. Instead, you risked everything to tell me my own bodyguard wants me dead. Why?" Morgan's throat tightened. She'd known this question would come, but standing here under the full force of Chris Anderson's scrutiny made every prepared answer feel inadequate. "Because I saw things no one else saw," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 weeks ago, Eric was on the balcony at 2 a.m, whispering into his phone like he was terrified of being caught. His whole body language was wrong, guilty, nervous, afraid. Then the fake wine supplier came. I noticed his shoes, Italian leather, custom made. No delivery driver wears $2,000 shoes. And the way he and Eric exchanged that pouch, it was practiced, rehearsed. Chris listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face, absorbing every detail with the focus of someone mapping terrain before a battle. "And tonight," Morgan continued, "when you asked Eric about Philadelphia, he hesitated. Half a second. But I saw it. I saw him calculating, lying, and I knew—" Her voice cracked slightly. "I knew if I didn't warn you, you'd walk into whatever trap he'd set." "You noticed all that," Chris said slowly, "and you connected it, while everyone else in this penthouse saw nothing." "I've spent my whole life noticing things," Morgan said quietly. "It's how I survived foster care, bad neighborhoods, worse jobs. You learn to read people when being wrong means getting hurt." Something shifted in Chris's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or respect for a skill set he hadn't known she possessed. He studied her for another long moment, and Morgan felt truly seen for the first time in 8 months. Not as invisible help, but as someone with intelligence, perception, value beyond her ability to clean and serve.
"The man who cornered you," Chris said finally, his voice taking on a darker edge. "He wasn't there to kill you. Not yet."
Morgan's breath caught.
"Then what?" "He was surveillance, making sure you stayed isolated until Eric could complete the handoff."
Chris's jaw tightened.
"They weren't after you, Morgan. They were waiting for Eric to deliver me. The Philadelphia meeting? That's when it happens. Eric creates a vulnerability in my security, and the people who paid him finish what they contracted for. You weren't a target. You were a complication they needed to manage until the primary transaction was complete."
The words hit Morgan like physical blows. She hadn't just stumbled into a betrayal. She'd stepped into the middle of a coordinated assassination plot, a professional contract with moving parts and contingency plans, and her warning had disrupted the entire timeline. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't understand how big."
"No one would expect you to."
Chris's voice softened fractionally.
"But you saw it anyway. You saw what 7 years of trust made me blind to."
He turned away, his hand bracing against the wall, and Morgan watched him process the full weight of Eric's betrayal. Not just the tactical implications, but the personal devastation of discovering that loyalty he'd believed absolute had been for sale all along. When Chris turned back, his expression had hardened into something cold and final.
"I'm going to confront him,"
he said quietly. "Eric's going to tell me who paid him, how deep this goes, and exactly what they plan to do with me once he delivered." His eyes found Morgan's.
"And you're going to stay in this room with 2 guards outside until I'm finished. You've done enough. The rest is my world to handle."
"Chris." His name left her lips before she could stop it. Too familiar, too intimate for what she was supposed to be. He noticed, but he didn't correct her.
"You saved my life tonight, Morgan,"
he said, and the way he spoke her name carried a weight she couldn't quite interpret.
"Now let me make sure you survive what comes next."
Chris emerged from the secure room with Morgan following at a distance, his 2 most trusted guards flanking them. His face had transformed into something carved from ice, emotionless, controlled, but radiating a danger that made the air feel charged with electricity. Morgan had seen Chris calm, focused, even occasionally warm in his reserved way. But this was different. This was a man preparing to destroy someone who'd broken something sacred.
"Stay behind me,"
he said to Morgan without looking back.
"Don't speak. Don't move unless I tell you to."
They walked through the corridor toward the main room, their footsteps echoing against marble floors. Morgan's heart hammered against her ribs, her hands trembling despite her efforts to control them. She'd set this in motion with her note, her whispered warning, and now she was about to witness the consequences unfold. The main room looked exactly as they'd left it, bodyguards stationed along the walls, the leather chair where Chris had been sitting. Documents still spread across the table, and Eric, standing in his usual position near the eastern wall, his posture professional, his face blank, completely unaware that his carefully constructed plan had just collapsed. Chris entered the room with deliberate slowness, his guards taking positions that subtly blocked the exits. Morgan stayed near the doorway, making herself as small as possible, but her eyes couldn't look away from what was about to happen. Eric straightened when he saw Chris, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, confusion that Chris had left and returned so quickly that his routine had been disrupted. But he didn't speak, just waited for orders the way he'd done for 7 years. Chris didn't sit, didn't move toward his chair, didn't issue instructions or ask questions. He just stared at Eric with eyes that had gone absolutely cold, and in that stare, everything communicated itself without words. Morgan watched Eric's face drain of color in real time, watched recognition dawn like a sunrise revealing devastation in its wake. His eyes widened fractionally, his breathing changed rhythm, and his hand twitched toward his coat, toward whatever weapon he kept concealed there, toward some desperate last option that might salvage what was already lost. But Chris moved faster than Morgan thought possible for a man his size. One moment, he was standing 5 feet away. The next, he'd closed the distance, his hand clamping around Eric's wrist with brutal efficiency, stopping the reach before it could complete. His other hand struck Eric's throat. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to paralyze, to eliminate any possibility of resistance. "Now," Chris said, his voice deadly quiet, and his guards moved like choreographed dancers. They seized Eric from both sides, their grips iron hard, dragging him forward and forcing him to his knees with movements that suggested they'd done this before, that subduing threats was muscle memory written into their bones. Eric's knees hit the marble with a crack that made Morgan flinch. His face contorted, pain, fear, and desperate calculation all fighting for dominance. "Chris, listen!" His voice came out strangled, panicked. "I can explain. It's not what you think. They threatened my family. They said if I didn't cooperate, stop talking." Chris's words cut through Eric's excuses like a blade through paper. "I've seen the footage, the phone calls, the supplier, the signals. I know about Philadelphia. I know about the handoff. I know exactly what you sold me for." Eric's face crumpled, the lies dissolving into something raw and terrified. "You don't understand the pressure. The money they offered. They said they'd kill everyone I said stop talking." The finality in Chris's voice silenced Eric completely. Morgan stood frozen near the doorway, trembling despite her efforts at control, shocked by the speed of it all. How quickly trust could transform into violence, how thin the veneer of civilization was in Chris Anderson's world, how brutal the consequences of betrayal. Chris turned away from Eric, his jaw tight with barely contained fury, and his eyes found Morgan across the room. She felt pinned by that gaze, held in place by the intensity of it. "You were the only one who saw through him," Chris said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. 7 years I trusted him. 7 years he stood at my back. And you, 8 months in my employment, you saw what I was blind to." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "I don't forget that." It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was acknowledgement, recognition, a debt being marked in whatever internal ledger Chris kept of who owed what to whom. "Get him out of here," Chris said to his guards, his attention returning to Eric. "Put him in the south room. I want answers about who hired him, how much they paid, and exactly what they plan to do with me in Philadelphia. And I want those answers before sunrise." The guards hauled Eric to his feet and dragged him toward a door Morgan had never seen opened, his protests fading as they disappeared into the depths of the penthouse. Chris stood alone in the center of the room, his shoulders rigid with tension, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he turned to address the remaining guards, his voice sharp with command. "Lock down the penthouse. No one enters. No one leaves. Check every room, every corridor, every access point. If you find anyone who doesn't belong here, you bring them to me. Understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed through the room. Chris's eyes found Morgan again, and this time they carried something that might have been concern beneath the steel. "This is going to be a long night," he said quietly. "And you're in the middle of it now, whether you want to be or not." The penthouse felt different in lockdown. Doors sealed, guards positioned at every entry point. The normal hum of controlled activity replaced by watchful silence heavy with threat. Morgan sat in a room she'd cleaned dozens of times but never occupied. Leather furniture that cost more than her annual salary, suddenly feeling like a cage rather than luxury. Chris entered without knocking, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of scotch that probably cost what she made in a month. He poured without asking, set 1 glass in front of her, and took the chair across with the weariness of a man who'd just survived something that should have killed him. "Drink," he said. Not a suggestion. Morgan's hands shook as she lifted the glass, the scotch burning her throat but doing nothing to calm the trembling that had taken hold of her body. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the crystalline clarity of what she'd just witnessed. The violence, the betrayal, the brutal efficiency of Chris's world when it turned against someone. Chris drank deeply, then set his glass down with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that couldn't be softened. "By now, whoever hired Eric knows their plan failed. They know someone warned me, and they know it was you." Morgan's breath caught. "How could they?" "Eric had surveillance on him, body camera most likely, or someone watching from outside who saw our interaction. Doesn't matter which. What matters is they know." Chris leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "In my world, there are rules. People who save my life become assets, protected, valued, essential. People who know too much become targets, liabilities that need to be eliminated. People who betray become examples." He paused, letting each category settle. "You're all 3 now, Morgan." The words hit her like physical blows. She'd known there would be consequences, but hearing them laid out with such brutal honesty made the reality inescapable. "I can't go home," she whispered, the implications cascading through her mind. "I can't go back to my apartment, my life, anything." "No," Chris said quietly. "You can't. The moment you slipped me that note, the moment you whispered that warning, you crossed a line. You stepped into my world, and there's no stepping back out. Not safely. Not alive." Morgan felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd made her choice in the corridor, standing with that note in her trembling hands, knowing it might cost her everything. But knowing it intellectually and feeling the full weight of permanent exile from normalcy were different things entirely. "I'm scared," she said, the admission escaping before she could stop it. "You should be," Chris replied, but his voice softened fractionally. "Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful. But understand this, you're safer in my world than you'd be trying to hide in yours. They'd find you in hours. Here, under my protection, you have a chance." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked Manhattan's glittering expanse. "I'm moving you to the north wing. Secure room, reinforced door, panic button that connects directly to my private line. You'll have a shadow guard, someone I've trusted for years, who stays within 20 feet of you at all times." "For how long?" Morgan asked, though she already knew the answer. "Until I've eliminated the threat, or until—" He trailed off, but the unspoken end of that sentence hung heavy in the air. "Until they eliminate you." Chris turned back to face her. "There will be retaliation.
Whoever paid Eric will send others. Professional, careful, patient. They won't stop because one plan failed. They'll adapt, wait, look for weaknesses, and you, Morgan, you're a weakness now. A loose end they need to tie up.
Jesus, she breathed, the full scope of it overwhelming. I need you to listen very carefully. Chris returned to his chair, his expression grave. The next few days will determine whether you survive this. You follow every instruction I give without question. You don't leave protected areas. You don't trust anyone I haven't personally vetted. You assume every conversation is monitored, every movement watched. You become paranoid, hypervigilant, suspicious of everything. Can you do that? Morgan thought about Harlem, about foster care, about every survival skill she'd ever developed. Yes. Good. Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. Because you have value to me now. Not just because you saved my life, though that debt is real and permanent, but because you saw patterns 7 trained guards missed. You have instincts that most people in my organization would kill for, and I protect what's valuable. The way he said it sent a strange warmth through her chest despite the terror. Not romantic, nothing so simple, but recognition. The same recognition she'd seen in his eyes when he'd read her note. The acknowledgement that she was more than she appeared, that invisibility had been camouflage for intelligence he could use. What happens now? Morgan asked. Now, Chris said, standing and offering his hand to help her up. I teach you how to survive in a world that wants you dead, and you trust that I'm better at keeping people alive than Eric's employers are at killing them. Morgan took his hand, felt the callous strength of it, and let him pull her to her feet. She'd saved his life tonight. Now he would try to save hers. And somehow, despite the fear coursing through her veins, despite knowing she could never return to the anonymous safety of her old existence, she felt something unexpected. Hope. 3 hours past midnight, after the guards had swept the penthouse twice, and Morgan had been moved to the North Wing's secured room, a soft knock interrupted the silence that had finally allowed her racing thoughts to slow. One of Chris's trusted guards stood in the doorway, his expression neutral. Mr. Gia! Anderson wants to see you in his office. Morgan's stomach tightened. She'd been expecting interrogation, debriefing, perhaps anger that she'd disrupted his world so completely. She followed the guard through corridors that felt different now. Not the spaces she'd cleaned as invisible help, but territory that held danger in every shadow, threat behind every closed door. Chris's private office was smaller than she'd imagined, more intimate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, actual books, not for show, and a massive desk dominated the space. He stood at the window overlooking the city, still wearing the same shirt from earlier. Sleeves still rolled to his elbows, exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. He turned when she entered, and the guard closed the door behind her, leaving them alone. Sit, Chris said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. Morgan sat, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. Chris remained standing, studying her with that penetrating focus that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen in ways she'd never experienced. I've made a decision about you, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of something already concluded, not up for debate. I want you to stay, not as a maid. That's finished. I want you to work for me, properly, as part of my inner circle. Morgan's breath caught. I don't understand. You have instincts most people spend decades trying to develop. Chris interrupted. You see patterns, read people, notice details others miss. Tonight you identified a threat that 7 years of trust made me blind to.
That kind of perception is worth more than 10 bodyguards with guns. He moved closer, leaning against the desk's edge, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm not asking out of kindness, Morgan. I'm asking out of necessity. You're too valuable to waste, too perceptive to lose. And now that you're in this world, you need protection I can provide. So stay with me, work for me. Let me teach you how to survive here. There was something else in his voice beyond the tactical assessment, something that made Morgan's pulse quicken. Respect, certainly, the acknowledgement of an equal rather than a subordinate, but also curiosity, as if he genuinely wanted to understand how she'd developed the ability to see what others couldn't. And beneath that, almost hidden, a flicker of human warmth from a man who rarely allowed himself such vulnerability. What would I do? Morgan asked, her voice steadier than she felt. What you did tonight. Watch. Listen. Tell me what you see. Be my eyes in places where armed guards can't go. In conversations where weapons make people cautious, but a quiet woman in the background doesn't register as threat. He paused. I'm offering you power, Morgan. Not the kind that comes from violence, but the kind that comes from knowing things others don't, from being trusted with information that changes outcomes. Morgan thought about her life before this night, the poverty that had shaped every decision since childhood, the fear that had been her constant companion, the invisibility that had felt like protection, but was really just erasure. She thought about scrubbing floors in apartments worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes, serving people who never bothered learning her name, existing in the margins of other people's stories. And she realized something that took her breath away. For the first time in her life, someone powerful was offering her a place beside them, not beneath them, not as help, not as service, but as someone whose mind, whose observations, whose very existence held value. People in your world, she said slowly, they'll never accept me. I'm just... You're the woman who saved my life when my most trusted guard tried to sell it, Chris interrupted, his voice carrying absolute certainty. That earns respect in ways nothing else can. And anyone who doesn't accept you answers to me. The protection implicit in those words settled over Morgan like armor. Not because she trusted Chris completely, she was too smart for blind trust, but because she understood he meant what he said. In his world, debts were honored, loyalty was rewarded, and the woman who'd seen through betrayal when no one else had would be protected as fiercely as she'd protected him. What if I'm not good enough? The vulnerability escaped before she could stop it. What if I make mistakes, miss things, fail you? Then you learn, Chris said simply. Just like everyone else in this life. But I don't think you will. Your instincts are too sharp. You've been training for this your whole life without knowing it. Morgan met his gaze, saw the offer laid bare. Not salvation, not rescue, but opportunity wrapped in danger and possibility she'd never imagined reaching for. She thought about the girl she'd been in Harlem foster care, promising herself that if she ever had the chance to be more than invisible, to matter in a way that changed something, she would take it, even if it terrified her. I accept, Morgan said, and felt her entire life pivot on those two words. Chris's expression shifted, relief perhaps, or satisfaction, and he extended his hand. Then welcome to my world, Morgan Gold. I hope you survive it. She took his hand, felt the warmth and strength of it,
and understood that she'd just crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. But for the first time since childhood, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt like she mattered. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded across weeks that felt simultaneously endless and impossibly compressed, each day stripping away another layer of who Morgan had been and replacing it with something sharper, harder, more capable. Chris kept his word. The morning after she accepted his offer, Morgan woke in her secured room to find new clothes waiting, tailored pieces that looked professional but allowed movement, expensive but not ostentatious, a far cry from her maid's uniform but still designed to help her blend into backgrounds when necessary. Her training began immediately. Michael, one of Chris's oldest associates, a man whose scarred hands and quiet intensity suggested decades of survival in this world, taught her to read rooms the way she'd been reading people. Where exits were, who watched them, which angles offered vulnerability. He showed her how power positioned itself in space, how dangerous men revealed themselves through micro-expressions and unconscious gestures. "You already have the instincts," Michael told her during their third session, after she'd correctly identified which of Chris's business associates was lying about his loyalty. "We're just giving you the language to articulate what you've always sensed." Sophia, a woman who served as Chris's information broker and occasional negotiator, taught Morgan about the architecture of the criminal underworld, who owed what to whom, which families held power, where alliances formed and fractured. She explained how information moved through this world like currency, how a single observed detail could shift the balance of power. "You're not here to carry guns," Sophia said, her sharp eyes assessing Morgan with approval. "You're here because you see things. That makes you more dangerous than 10 armed men if you know how to use it." The respect came slowly, earned through careful observation and accurate reporting. When Morgan identified a potential security breach during a high-stakes meeting, noticing that one of the attendees wore a watch with a camera concealed in its face, Chris's inner circle stopped seeing her as the maid he'd elevated out of sentimentality and started seeing her as an asset. She learned to watch patterns of behavior, to identify when routine shifted in ways that suggested planning. She studied body language until she could read tension, deception, fear, and aggression in the set of shoulders or the angle of a gaze. She developed the ability to become invisible again when needed, but now it was tactical rather than survival-born, a choice rather than a necessity. Morgan didn't transform into a killer. She had no interest in violence, and Chris never asked it of her. Instead, she became something more valuable, a strategist with intuitive understanding of human nature, someone who could sit quietly in a room full of dangerous men and afterward tell Chris exactly who was planning betrayal, who was genuinely loyal, and who was too afraid to be either. Chris watched her evolution with an interest that went beyond professional assessment. Sometimes Morgan would catch him observing her during meetings, his expression thoughtful, as if trying to understand how someone who'd spent years invisible had developed such penetrating insight into the visible world of power. 3 months after the night she'd saved his life, Morgan's role had solidified into something unprecedented in Chris's organization. She attended meetings not as decoration, but as essential personnel. She briefed him on observations that shaped his decisions. She earned the grudging respect of men who'd initially dismissed her, proving repeatedly that her instincts were rarely wrong. The apartments she'd once cleaned as a maid now felt like a different universe, one she'd left behind so completely, it seemed impossible she'd ever belong there. One evening, as winter deepened into the kind of cold that made Manhattan's lights seem sharper against the darkness, Morgan entered Chris's office with his nightly briefing papers, intelligence gathered from the day's meetings, patterns she'd identified, concerns she thought required his attention. Chris took the papers, but instead of immediately reading them, he studied her face.
the exhaustion she carried,
the sharpness in her eyes that hadn't existed 3 months ago, the confidence in her posture that came from knowing she belonged in this room.
"You've adapted faster than anyone I've ever brought into this world,"
he said quietly.
"Most people take years to develop the instincts you've honed in months."
"I had good teachers," Morgan replied,
"and strong motivation to survive."
Chris set the papers down, leaned back in his chair, and something shifted in his expression. A rare moment of vulnerability from a man who showed so little of himself.
"You saved my life once,"
he said, his voice carrying weight that made the words feel ceremonial.
"That night with the note, the warning, you gave me a chance to survive when I didn't even know I needed saving."
He paused, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Now I'm giving you one of your own, a life that's yours to shape, not one handed to you by circumstance or poverty or invisibility. You're not the maid anymore, Morgan. You're not the overlooked woman surviving in the margins. You're essential. You matter. And in this world, that's the most valuable thing anyone can be." Morgan felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough in her old life, tears of frustration, exhaustion, fear. This new life demanded strength she was still learning to trust. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more deeply than any words she'd ever spoken. Chris nodded once, then returned his attention to the briefing papers. The moment of intimacy closed as quickly as it had opened. But as Morgan left his office, walking through corridors she now navigated with confidence rather than fear. She understood the full scope of what had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, no longer just surviving. Morgan Gold had stepped into the fire of Chris Anderson's world and emerged transformed, sharper, stronger, essential. And the war that had begun the night she'd slipped him that warning note was only just beginning. But this time, she was ready.